welcome to the Heritage Meets Modernity Podcast. My name is Sophia, and I'm working at Cusado doing research and developing content. In this podcast, we will discuss art, literature, and craft and their intersection in culture. And today I have with me CY, the founder of Cusado.
Hey, Sophia, how's it going?
It's been busy, and it's been a while since we actually recorded the previous episodes. I guess one of the things that's been on my mind recently, because of all of the places that I've been visiting while in Tokyo and also now in Hong Kong, is like museums and galleries and exhibitions or art fairs like that. I think if I recall correctly, in the previous episode, we did mention briefly about these sort of events and in terms of where people can go to learn more about art, different types of art, different forms of crafts, and like the cultural history behind these things. So I think this is a good chance to kind of talk about those things a little bit more. So I guess what I wanted to ask you first is, has your view on museums and galleries changed in recent years, or like how did you view them like in the past, maybe when you're younger versus now?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, and obviously museums and galleries hold important significance in the role of culture, right? Because museums are a place where cultures can be preserved. And I think the job of the museum is to show and restore artifacts that otherwise may have been lost to time. I think, as we discussed previously, um, going off of what um, Murose sensei talked about, right? Preservation of culture, preservation of art, that's not enough for the survival of art. Um, it has to be also continued. And I think that's where galleries come into play. And I think you have an interesting ecosystem in which a museum is there. It's and we also have to divide them into like free museums. So maybe they're nationally supported, and private museums where maybe you have to pay an entrance fee. But those are, I would say, more accessible to the public, in which I think there's no pressure to spend, let's say, additional money outside of maybe at the museum shop, right? But then in terms of galleries, especially as a younger person, going into a gallery, I think is more challenging because you are kind of hyper aware that these things are for sale. And I think a lot of times people don't want to go into galleries because they think, well, I don't want to be wasting this person's time, right? Like, I don't want to be a bother or a nuisance to these people who are working. And so I think definitely in the before times, I was more reticent to go into galleries. But I think what that means is, therefore, it was harder for me to understand what contemporary artists are doing, right? And I think galleries hold an important space in this industry by giving contemporary artists a way to showcase what they're all about. And I think that's something that maybe museums can't and maybe shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, I think I do agree with your point about in the past, I never really visited galleries much. Like museums were something I was always interested in, like since I was young. And because of how they're set up, like either they're free for the public or, you just pay like a small entrance fee and you're kind of just free to take your own time, explore it at your own pace type of thing. So I do think it was only recently when I started visiting galleries that I realized there's a lot more that you can learn about, especially in more of the contemporary um, space. Like, what are the current artists actually doing? What are they working on? What are they exploring? So I think it's very interesting to actually compare the two. And I also learned that galleries play an important role in helping certain museums actually acquire contemporary works. So, for example, I only learned about this recently, but like the exhibits in the Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK, a lot of their works are actually also from contemporary artists. And there's a gallery in Hong Kong that does a lot of, like, helps them to acquire a lot of these from contemporary artists, like in Japan, in China, like across Asia. So I think it's interesting just to see how different types of museums and different types of galleries, how they all actually function together. Because I guess in the past, when I was just more of a casual viewer, I always viewed these things as sort of separate from each other. And, like the galleries, I thought they mainly deal directly with collectors or, the customers. Never really thought about them interacting with these larger institutions and museums to actually, I guess, also to kind of bridge that gap between museums having stuff from the past, like antiques or artifacts, but also trying to bridge that gap towards the stuff that are created now, like the modern works. And I think it was interesting. One of the recent exhibitions in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Museum of Art, their focus was actually works from China from like all the way back to, I believe it was Shang Dynasty, or I don't exactly remember, but like from thousands of years ago. But they also place some of the works together with contemporary works. And that way you can actually see the influence from all these works from like few hundred years ago or a few thousand years ago. You can still see similar elements showing up in contemporary works. So I think that was a very nice way to actually present things, because I think if you saw them separately, or at least for me, I wouldn't necessarily have drawn that connection between the two. And then, so having works from 1,000 years ago all the way up to now, side by side, that really helped me make that connection and like appreciate that kind of link through history more. So I think that's one thing that was kind of new to me as I start to pay more attention to these sort of things.
But I think that if I were to ask you what are the two most famous museums in the world, which ones would you say?
Most famous
Yeah.
museums in the world.
Yeah, let's start with the most famous one. What do you think is the most famous museum in the world?
Um,
I think there
well,
is
I
a
guess
right
because
answer.
is there a right
Yeah,
answer?
I think there is a right
I'm a
answer.
little bit more skewed towards like the art side
Yeah,
of things at
yeah.
the moment, but I would say like the Met,
Oh,
maybe.
okay, yeah,
I
okay,
don't know, cause
yeah,
like for me,
yeah. I would say the Louvre is probably the most
oh
famous
yeah, yeah,
museum in
yeah,
the
yeah,
world,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
It has the
I
Mona
think
Lisa and all that stuff.
yeah.
And
I
then,
mean, I have been to the Louvre, but I actually had to speed walk it, which was
yeah,
not a great experience. But
yeah,
yes, now that you mention it, yes, the Louvre.
yeah. And I think the second most famous, or maybe, you know, people there would say it's the most famous, is the British Museum. Yeah.
Okay, that one I haven't been.
And I've been lucky enough to live very close to both those museums. Um, and I think there's a really and you know, I just came back from the Met this summer or last summer in August, so not that long ago. But I think there's a really different um, approach that Western museums take versus Eastern museums. And I think I wasn't really into like museum culture so much. I mean, especially when I was living in Europe, I had the opportunity to go to obviously the Louvre, Musée d'Orsay, Museum Island in Berlin. It wasn't really so interesting for me because I feel like Western museums, at least the ones that I had gone to, the big famous ones, it seemed like there was a lot more focus on portrait, which makes sense because portrait painting and still life was a big part of European art. And then their artifacts, I think it's more important for them, rather than to restore it, is to show the condition as it is. And I think we talked a little bit about this, where I think in the West, and don't give me credit for this because somebody else said it, I just don't remember who, but it's almost like in the West they value the thing that um, the piece was made with, right? So um, it's important that this was the paint that Leonardo da Vinci used to paint, you know, the the whatever it is, or the Mona Lisa or whatever. So when you go to see the Mona Lisa, for example, it's not restored, right? It is kind of faded, it is kind of cracked, but their restoration is not to, let's say, go over it and essentially repaint it so that you can see how it was when it was made. Compared to, I think, the Japanese approach to restoration, and this is an actual profession. A lot of urushi masters and artists start off as restorers of artifacts by restoring the piece, restoring the cracks to how they were or how they would have been back in the day. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, well, I know a little bit more about the urushi conservation efforts, and there's definitely a big difference between how they do it in the West versus like in Japan and China, because in the West the focus is on reversibility. So they want to be able to restore it to a certain extent, but if they need to do corrections or revisit it at a later point, they want to be able to reverse what they've done and then like make the changes. But because of the nature of urushi, which is the original material, you cannot undo it once it's cured. So in that sense, they're using materials that may not be able to restore urushi work to what it was originally like. And that can also cause some problems when they try to revisit it in the future because there is maybe some slight incompatibility with the materials. So it's just quite interesting. I don't know whether they're shifting directions in terms of like with the urushi restoration. But this is just from what I've seen like in documentaries or interviews online where there are different approaches.
But the result is that, therefore, the way they display the piece is also very different. I feel like and I went to the US National Museum of Asian Art as well as the Met, and I think a lot of the lighting was very dark and dim, and even the paintings with the gold foil was not really so bright. It was very much faded. Whereas the Tokyo National Museum here in Ueno, when you go and see the artifacts, the lighting, I feel, is much brighter, much clearer, much easier to see the piece. And I think that's also because there's a difference between something that has been restored, and therefore you can, maybe display it in brighter light, versus something that maybe hasn't been restored in the same way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And the museum display does really impact how you interact with the works. So I do feel like, but because I'm not an expert in conservation and stuff, but I guess each museum has their own way of deciding how they want to preserve or like present their pieces. But I think that's why it's also interesting. And I didn't think about this before, but a lot of museums, like a national museum type of thing, they're exhibits rotate quite frequently. So you might go like, 1 month and then you see all the works on display, but you go like 2 or 3 months later, it could be completely different, or like parts of the museum could be completely different. And because some of the works, they do need to rest them in that sense, they can't display them out for too long because of potential damage. So I think that's something that, it's like you can go to the same museum 2 or 3 times a year and still see completely different things or have a completely different theme. So I think that's what the nice thing about museums that I didn't consider before is that they actually do have huge collections and they only display a fraction of them every single time. And so you can go back to the same place and kind of, depending, they will always have some sort of theme going on. And you can learn a little bit more every time you visit. So it's not just like a one-off visit type of thing. But of course, that only really works if you're in that location. You're like living there or you visit that place quite often. Um, but I think that's what a lot of people, at least the people I've talked to, they don't really consider. They think, oh, you've been to this museum already. You don't need to go back again, or it's not that interesting to go again and look at the same things again. But maybe I'm probably a little bit more biased in this regard, but like even that exhibition in the Hong Kong Museum, I went 3 times and it's the same exhibition, but every time I spot something different or I spot something that I might have missed earlier on. And it's just like there's actually a lot. What I didn't appreciate before is that there is a lot of information that museums put together as part of the display and kind of explaining the history behind the works, or like how their curation, like what are they trying to present through their curation. And I think that's also, I guess, like the slight difference between galleries and museums. They're both curated exhibitions in that sense. But the museums, I guess, have more of that educational focus. Um, Whereas galleries generally do have more of the commercial focus, where they're helping to sell the works of the artists. But yeah, so that's an interesting thing. But I guess that, to me, that brings up the point where, although museums, I mean, museums have been around for a long time at this point, but there have been like reports. I guess I know more about on the Hong Kong side, but there have been reports about how the funding for these museums, they're decreasing every year, or like most museums are actually running at a deficit, which I think a lot of people don't actually realize. And because some museums are even free of charge, you don't have to pay anything to enter, but they still have their like operating costs, and they still have to maintain the works in their collection. So how are they able to continue this and continue providing this, essentially like a public service, when they're continually kind of running out of funds at the moment? And I think that brings it back to the question of, do we as a society actually value the arts and value culture, and how does that impact institutions like museums?
Well, if you talk about society right now, I mean, obviously it's not really valuing it. And you can see that all over the world, right? Otherwise, we would have funding, right? We would have more focus on this, but, clearly we don't. But at the same time, we have had periods of history where arts wasn't valued, and therefore artistic endeavors did not flourish, right? And you can see that through the museum pieces as well. A lot of the pieces, they come from a very similar time period. At least the ones that are considered really good, right, come from the same time period. And so maybe this is just a natural ebb and flow of things. But I think the provenance of how these pieces come to be acquired by these museums is also something that's really interesting because and also relevant because as I think most people know, museums rely heavily on donations, and oftentimes there's entire exhibits are donated by one family, right? So just because there isn't a funding for arts or museums, that doesn't mean that in the future we won't have museums. Um, but maybe it will depend more on these private collectors in the future, maybe when they pass away, or maybe a couple generations down, or maybe even in their own generation, they decide to donate their private collections to a museum, right? That can significantly lower the cost of acquisition for a lot of museums. Or like the case of Liang Yi Museum, they open their own private museum, but it's actually free of charge. And, you can make an appointment to go and see the artifacts. And then maybe one day that will also be part of a museum.
Well, actually, it's not free of charge. That one you do have to pay a small entry fee. But I think, like, because you brought up the Liang Yi Museum, I also wanted to highlight, because I don't think I've encountered this type of museum elsewhere, but they actually allow you to interact with almost all of the exhibits, which is pretty cool. So you're like handling stuff from Edo period, or like even like few hundred years back, and you're able to actually see these items up close, instead of usually when you go to a museum it's always behind like a glass display, and you can't see all the details clearly. So I think the Liang Yi, I think that's the benefit for private museums versus the public ones, is they can decide their own way of displaying things. And I think that's another way of letting people appreciate these type of works.
But that's what I mean, though, right? Like, even in a time now where maybe public museums can't be funded, and it's very hard for individuals to fund public museums because of such a big cost. But maybe it's possible for me. Let's say here, right? I have some urushi bowls, and maybe these will make their way into a museum one day, because I decide to donate this to a museum. And then they'll have an example of Heisei lacquer, or I have something else here as well, right? Like I have these, right? And maybe one day these will make themselves into a museum, but I have to acquire them first, right? So I think, how can we help protect, and in a way, museums are an institution to safeguard this kind of culture, but we can also be temporary custodians of these artifacts too, right? And that's why I think, and sometimes we really, really forget that, one day we will become history, right? I was in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, and I went to visit my grandparents' grave, and there I never paid attention before, but this time I was just curious, and I looked at the year that my grandfather was born, and he was born in 1907, which means he was born as a subject of the Qing dynasty, right? Uh, and then when he was 4 years old, he um, the Qing dynasty fell, and then you had the warlords era. Um, and then in 1933, the invasion of Manchuria by Japanese imperial forces. And then in 45, the Japanese surrendered. World War II, it was back to the Republic of China. And then in 49, he fled to Hong Kong, so he became a British subject, and then he almost lived to see Hong Kong go back to Chinese rule. And it's pretty crazy, right? Like somebody who was born as a subject of the Qing dynasty lived to see the invention of the telephone, right? Lived to see airplanes fly in the sky and maybe even ride on an airplane. So one day we will also be history, right? Like one day, maybe 100 years from now, people will be like, oh, back in the 2025s, like all of these world happenings occurred, and then these people were there. And I think it's easy to forget that. So similarly, the artifacts that we acquired that we find beautiful today, right, they'll also have a history to them. And so even if we can't support the funding of an entire museum, maybe through our own likes and interests, we can collect, you know, some objects, some artifacts, and then pass them on to a museum one day down the line in the future too, right? I think that's a very ethical way for museums to gather or acquire items. Obviously, there's the less ethical ways, which is through warfare and looting, which is what most of the British Museum and the Louvre is. But, it's when we think about how we can contribute to sponsoring the arts and also keeping this spirit of making art important in this time of, quite frankly, an attack on the arts, because it is so anti, or it is so antithetical to hypercapitalism, that we forget actually when we acquire art, that is also a way to protect the arts. That is also a way for us to help become guardians of art. And then one day we can pass that into the public domain, into the public realm, even if it is a small paid donation, as it is in the Liang Yi Museum, which I think, by the way, totally worth it. But the owner of those artifacts had to first acquire them, right? Had to first buy them. And I think he's 80 years old? So a lot of the things in there, maybe, were things that were made when he was a young kid, right? But now we think are, artifacts that are in museums. But in fact, 80 years ago was just the end of World War II.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to frame it that way, because we don't think about the things that are made now, like 30, 50, 100 years down the line, will they even still exist? Or especially now, like everything is much more mass produced, and some could argue don't last very long, or get thrown out really quickly. So we don't necessarily think about the longevity of items anymore. But then in the past, things had to be made to last, to be used for many, many decades. And so that's why we can still see them now. We can still see stuff made 1,000 years ago, that are still, they're still, if you wanted to use them, I guess some of them you could even still use them.
But that's why we have to find and seek out the high quality things. And even in, let's say, lacquerwork, right? There's lacquerwork that's going to last 100 years, maybe 1,000 years. And there's lacquerwork that's going to last maybe 10 years. And you're okay with that because it costs $200. And, you're the guardian of that. And that was fine. It then puts into question, let's say, a company like ours, where we're in the business of making things. We then have a choice. Do we want to make things that are going to be future antiques, right? Do we want to be making things that are future museum pieces, or do we want to make something else? And maybe it's a combination of both, right? Because, right now we make a product that is, it's expensive, right? It's made with very high quality materials. And then we have a more premium line, right? A more luxury line of maybe entry entry-level makie. Right, let's call it entry-level makie, where this is what newer artists are doing. This is what newer craftspeople are doing. And then we have, or we're going to have, a line where this is, done by Wajima masters who are the inheritors of that technique. And so when we have a collection like that, that's a very conscious choice for us as a company to build out our collection like that, right? Because now maybe not everything is going to be in a museum one day, but if it is, it's an interesting way to show how businesses and companies in this era wanted to think about art, wanted to think about culture, and wanted to protect that culture, knowing that not everybody can buy the highest end, right? Knowing that not everybody can afford to get the highest quality of items, right? Therefore, we have, I wouldn't say it's an inexpensive item, but still an item that can last. And when we present the collection in that way, it's something that a customer can consider as well, right? Like, people probably aren't going to donate our pens into a museum, maybe a pen museum, right? But maybe not the national museum. But somebody might donate our collection of very high end, the top end of our makie collection that is going to come hopefully at the beginning of next year, right? Somebody might donate a full set of that to the National Museum. I think that's where it belongs. Whereas maybe a private museum, for example, fountain pens, right? You could have all sorts of pens in there. And anyway, those are both protecting culture and creating a snapshot in time. Yeah. But let's say if we were to, let's say, produce something, really on the extreme entry level, let's say on the level of, let's say, a kakuno, right? That would be interesting as a piece in itself, but that's probably, again, not going to make it into the National Museum.
So I think that point you said about protecting culture and what can we do now, like as a business or even as a consumer, to protect the things that we think are important and we think that have value, um, is also being able to support the younger generation of either artists or craftsmen who are just starting in their journey. Because I think, of course, like one of the common points that people always bring out is that, a lot of these traditional crafts or handmade stuff, the older generation are still doing it because they started, 30, 40 years ago. But as the whole industry has declined over the past few decades, even if there are younger people who want to enter the field or want to take this up as a profession, it's getting harder and harder for them just because the support is not there or the demand is not there or they haven't like established themselves well enough in that industry to kind of fully support themselves. So I think it's like, how can we support both the people who have been doing this for decades, um, firstly, so that they can also pass down their skills to the younger generation, and then how can we also support this newer generation of artists coming up so that they can develop the skills to become the next master, artist, and then continue that cycle. So I think that is a very important question that we're always thinking of, how to balance everything.
I think it's always about, at least in our contemporary society, it's about money, right? It's about whether you can make enough money to survive. And surely the people, the old masters, they didn't start this thinking that, oh, this is going to be a dying art in the future. But and I think this is where galleries really come into place, where I was at at an event a couple weeks ago about traditional Edo crafts. So this is crafts that essentially come from the Tokyo area. And there were a lot of really interesting craftspeople, and all of their skills were incredible, absolutely amazing. But the items that they made, they're of a different generation. The output that they created, I'll give you a couple examples. Um, there was a cloisonné artist, and they made like brooches and pins out of cloisonné. And I think, that's cool. The skill is incredible, but I would never want to use that. Or there was another person with a tortoiseshell craftsperson, and they made like these pendants. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's cool, but I don't want to wear a tortoiseshell pendant, right? It's very much like maybe something my grandmother would want it to have worn. But they grew up. I mean, they professionally grew up during that era where that kind of stuff sold, right? Whereas I think if you look on the flip side, if you look at Taobao, right? There's a lot of artists that sell their stuff through Taobao, and they're creating things that are really, it's both old but can suit a modern lifestyle, right? There's this there's there's like this teapot holder thing, which is, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's essentially like a stand for a teapot, and then on the bottom there's like a stove, so you can cook the tea, or you can make the tea, you can brew the tea on the stove thing. It's and there's like this string, and you dangle the teapot on the string, and because it's heavy, right? So it goes down, and then there's fire on the stove, and you just boil the water like that. And that's so stupid, but it's cool, It's an interesting thing. It looks nice, and I think it might be something that my grandmother would have, but it's also something that I might have. So in that sense, galleries are important because they have a market focus, right? They have to sell the items in order to stay alive. So they can help the contemporary artists understand what is something that can sell and what's something that can't.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it, because I feel like, well, maybe not so much for the traditional craft side of things, but like with more and more people being able to sell directly online, like either like paintings or illustrations and stuff like that. So some people may even think, what's the point of galleries? Because the truth is, galleries, they will take a percentage. That's how um, they're able to survive, because they have costs on their end, right? So if you as an artist, or you as a craftsperson, sell through a gallery, um, the gallery will be taking a percentage of the total sale. That's just the reality of things. And so some people think, okay, then it's better to go directly to the artist and purchase from them. Or as an artist, you'll be like, oh, I should try and just do everything by myself, instead of going through a gallery, which I think for certain people it can work. But in terms of sustainability for both the artist and also the industry, I think galleries are still very, very important in terms of the reach that they have, just connecting either the collectors or the customers to not just individual artists, but like artists within the entire industry, or like in a similar field. So I think, yeah, it's very important that we think of this as like a whole ecosystem of sorts. So it's like the artist working together with galleries, and through the galleries they make connection with the museums, and through the museums you're able to get a greater reach to more of the public, and that in the end feeds back to the artist and helps to support the artist. Yeah, and I think galleries also, at least the ones that I've been visiting, they do a lot on the actual like workshops or like experiences. So it's not just to sell the physical products, but it's also to invite these artists over to actually teach workshops and have classes so that they can also spread appreciation of the craft and actually getting people to experience like having hands-on experience. So for example, I did a Chinkin workshop recently, which was really fun. And it's something I've been wanting to do for quite a long time, but you know, sourcing the materials yourself, trying to figure out how to use the tools yourself, that is quite challenging sometimes. So, it's nice that the galleries are able to support um, the artists or the craftspeople through providing like a space to hold lessons and to teach other people. And that in turn, I think when you're able to even just briefly experience how these things are created, you then appreciate the things that you see even more. Because when you see the final object, it can look very impressive. You can be like, okay, that looks super. You know that it takes a lot of work to create the final outcome, but in the end, you're still only seeing the final outcome. You don't see necessarily all the work that goes into it. So when you're joining these workshops and doing it yourself, and you have like back pain from crouching over for like 3 hours and staring at the thing, you're like, okay, now I understand. And I feel like, at least for me, that makes me have like an even deeper appreciation for all the stuff that I then interact with in the future. Even like looking at things created 200 years ago, 500 years ago, I also look at those things through a different lens, because then I can be like, back then they'd even have less technology than what we have now. Everything would have to have been manual. So it's just, sometimes it's even mind blowing.
And nobody sourced it for them. Nobody sourced this.
Yeah, like they have to create their own tools. They have to, and oftentimes they're actually creating the techniques at that time. Like we think of them now as traditional techniques that have been around for hundreds of years, but they were coming up.
Yeah, weren't traditional back then.
Yeah, they were coming up with these techniques at that time and at such a high level. Um, and it's just amazing to think about it in that sense. And also that makes us, at least that makes me think about, how does this field move forward now? Like, are we using technology to help us further improve these things? Or are we using it as a crutch sometimes to, just make things easier, make things faster? And yes, maybe you get to the same result or similar result in half the time. But does that mean we're not able to further push the technique or further explore things that will then, in 100 years, people look back and will be like, oh, how did they do this? Or like, that's, um, keep coming up with new innovations within these, creative fields.
Well, before we move on to that, I I also want to say that a lot of times I hear people saying, "Oh well, um, why don't I just work directly with the artist, right? Why should I go through you guys?" Um, and it's I think there's two effects of this. One, it therefore makes maybe the company that produces it, it makes us reticent to share who the artist is, right? Because um, nobody wants to be cut out. And then, um, on the other hand, I think galleries and producers, we have, and we're not a gallery, but we're kind of part of that ecosystem on the selling side. But we have an inherent interest in finding new artists, right? We have an inherent interest in finding new people, young people, to also continue that. So we want to showcase a bunch of different artists. Whereas if you're, maybe just directly working with the artist, then you're a fan of that artist, which is fine. That's also fair, right? I think that's completely fair. But then how do younger artists get the opportunity to, show up and showcase their skill, even if it's not at the same level as the master now, right? But the master got their opportunity somewhere previously because an artist wanted to, or a gallery wanted to highlight them, right? So, you know, we also very deliberately are working with Anusia, not directly working with the artist. Also for this reason as well, because the Anusia, they're free to work with a bunch of different artists, right? And find a bunch of different artists and cultivate them. And that's where the role of the gallery is as well, right? The gallery might be saying, okay, this is their first solo exhibition. And so, please come and support them, even if you don't buy anything, right? Even if you are just there to showcase. That's really important. And that's something that I don't think a museum can do. A museum can't be like, oh, this is, so-and-so's first exhibition. Come and, give these people a chance. That's just not their role, right? So then when I think, okay, how do we help push culture forward? How do we turn the current state, which is, there's not a lot of let's say, funding or governmental support for culture and art today. How do we turn that around, right? How can we do our part? Is, well, maybe we need to work with the galleries. Maybe we need to work with Nusias and not just a singular artist, but maybe a collective.
Yeah, I think that's quite an important point. And I know for myself, when I was, trying to learn more about Urushi and stuff, I actually came into contact with a lot of artists through the gallery here. Um, because, a lot of them, they are on Instagram or they have their website, but if you don't know how to search for them, you'll never find them, right? So I think galleries are very important, just, getting that exposure out there. And also I've been able to talk to a lot of the artists directly, when they come and visit Hong Kong, and you kind of learn about their process, and it's very interesting to talk to a lot of these different artists and just see how they view the field, or like how they're trying to make their own path in this sort of environment. And it's also very inspiring to talk to them, and you'll never get that type of experience if it's only online, right? Or it's like much harder to form that type of connection.
Or even if you only speak directly to the artists, well, how are you going to find other ones? I think, like, kind of going back to our main topic, I think the role of museums, in contrast to that, is, and something that I didn't really notice, is that in the Museum of Asian Arts in Washington, D.C., they had the Chinese gallery, and then they had the Islamic gallery, but in the same building. But that was really cool because you can see how deeply influential Islamic art was to Chinese ceramics, and therefore all the other aspects of Chinese art. It was a lot of Chinese objects and artifacts, we're kind of we've already talked about how it's heavily influenced by literature, right? But it's almost like using the Islamic aesthetic sense and applying it on Chinese literature to create a lot of the pottery that we now see and think are iconic.
Mm.
And that's something that
Yeah.
I think a gallery can't do, because their focus is much smaller, or maybe
Mm.
it's more themed or
Contemporary
yeah.
as well.
So I think in those ways, museums, especially public museums, can remind us of how culture travels too.
I think building on that is in Hong Kong, I actually didn't realize how many museums we had. I always had the impression that, okay, we have the main museums, like the public ones. So there's apparently a total of 104 museums, and 58 of them are actually private museums. So when I saw that number, I was pretty shocked, and I never um, knew about any of them until basically a few months ago when I was specifically searching for museums in Hong Kong. So yeah, I think it's just museums are in a way helping to show the connection between different cultures over time.
Different cultures and how they intersect.
Yeah, even like few hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago, like before the internet, before airplanes, before, like when people would have to travel like along the Silk Road or something like that. I think we kind of forget how culture evolved in the past. It has never really been isolated. It has always still been through interactions with different nations, different dynasties, different.
I mean, just look at Buddhism. Look at Buddhism. Buddhism came from India into China and spread to the rest of East Asia, right? One of the most famous Chinese novels. There are four great Chinese novels. One of them is Journey to the West, with the Monkey King. Um, that was them trying to go to India or to Tibet. So that cultural travel is so important. We forget about that as well. And by the way, that novel is the inspiration for Dragon Ball.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, the main character is Son Goku, which is Sun Hong
Oh,
in Chinese characters. So like there's always been a intersection in traveling, and then art again evolves, jumps through mediums, but we can trace the lineage of something, that's contemporary now. Maybe it's a little bit silly, but Dragon Ball, right? Through the journeys on the Silk Road. And then we can see how people made those journeys, where they may have stopped, literally, in these places, in these towns. And a lot of times, border towns were really important hubs of culture, because they would welcome travelers and merchants. And this is where museums can, protect that, understanding that history.
yeah. So I'm not sure whether this would be a good time to bring up AI
Well,
into the
yeah,
conversation.
you were talking about how do we use technology in the preservation of art? Do we use it as a crutch, or as a hindrance, or as a help? And um, I think I haven't really seen these in Western museums yet. I didn't really see this in the Met. I didn't really see this in British Museum. But I think the National Museum here, there's a whole room where um, you can interact with the objects through VR. And that's a really interesting way to bring artificial intelligence into museums, right? It's let's say, artificial intelligence in motion tracking, right? Seeing what somebody's doing in real space and then transforming that into information that can be displayed on, let's say, a monitor or a screen. Or actually, I saw this in not the British Museum, but the British Library had an exhibition, I think, where you could turn the objects around with your hands. So you go like this, and maybe you can turn it, spin it, so you can see the back of the piece as
Mm.
well. And
Oh
maybe,
yeah, they had that in the Hong Kong Museum here.
yeah.
And yeah.
But what would be cool is if that was actually linked to a spinning display where you can go like this and it spins the display, so you're not looking at a screen of it, right? You're actually turning it to see the back. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, actually, that is a pretty good idea because a lot of these objects in museums, you only see like the front view, maybe the side and back, but then there's always stuff at the bottom or in the inside that you can't actually see unless they specifically display it in a certain way. So I think like there was another museum in Atami in Museum of Art in Atami that I visited a
The one
couple
with the
months
urushi
ago.
doors. Yeah.
Yes, that one was very cool. Um, so they also had their works, but with like an iPad on the side. So you could scroll through and they show the different points of view of the same object. But yeah, that would be a good way to integrate like technology and, art.
I think it's always important to take, and this is just my view on AI. I don't think it's really been beneficial to mankind just yet, but I think there's a potential where you take AI and you apply it to physical items, right? You can have the physical item, but use AI to generate um, the scenes or the scenarios where this item might have been used in the past. And then you can interact with that, right? That would be a really cool application of artificial intelligence. Um, and, with the help of um, actual 3D modelers, right? You would create environments, and then the AI would detect how you as the museum goer, maybe how you are interacting with the artifacts to maybe prompt different dialogue bubbles that come up and prompt different explanations that come up. And that would be a good way to make these um, exhibits much more interactive and also, quite frankly, much more fun for a museum goer rather than just, looking at it, next.
I have been seeing it a little bit more frequently in the museums here, but especially with a lot of like the Chinese paintings, like the landscape paintings, the scenery paintings, they're always like it's very easy to just like glance over them because they all at some point they all kind of look the same. They all look very similar to each other. You just like walk in and you see a full room of like very very similar looking paintings. So you kind of it's very easy to brush over them. So I noticed like more of these exhibits, they're trying to introduce animations where they take the painting and they're animating parts of it to kind of show you this is what life was actually like the people in the paintings. What are they doing? Like they're traveling from place to place. So I thought that was an interesting way to incorporate technology into the display, but still have the true nature of the painting or like the original painting is still there for you to look at afterwards. Um, so I think those are like the benefits of technology and AI, but
I'm excited to see how um, Chinese museums will evolve over the next couple of decades. This trip back to Hong Kong really showed me how seriously um, China is taking the preservation and the continuation of arts um, on an individual level, but also on a governmental level. The fact that we got to see these crazy carved lacquer items, the Song Dynasty paintings, the Qing Dynasty robes, um, imperial robes too, right? In such good condition as well. All of these really incredible artifacts that were in display in, frankly, a relatively small museum, right? I mean, Hong Kong Museum of Arts is, in the scale of global museums, not a really large museum, but to have that displayed there, and it must have been a exhibit on loan because it was a timed exhibit, right? It makes me excited to see how um, the Chinese museums are going to kind of level up in the next 10, 20 years, especially because they are one of the leaders in AI technology too.
That's true. And I think like art in mainland has been kind of becoming a little bit more of a focus in like the last couple decades at least. Although there are always like challenges with art and with like how certain things are allowed or not
Sure, yeah.
allowed,
But
in this region.
Ai Weiwei, which is the most famous artist that was,
He
living.
recently went back.
Yeah, he went back.
Yeah, that was interesting. I was actually surprised when I
Yeah,
saw that. I was like, okay, that's interesting. But yeah, there are like I think China and also Hong Kong right now, they're doing well in terms of the antiquities. They really want to preserve the antiquities. They're doing active research because there are always things being dug up. Like in China, as they develop the land, they're always finding new like tombs or burial sites, which actually reinterprets how history has been thought of. Even now, there's a lot of ongoing research into some of these artifacts from like thousands of like 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and how it changes the interpretation of Chinese history actually. So I think they're they are trying to actively work on that and maintain that aspect, which is pretty interesting. Because this is something I think maybe because especially growing up in Hong Kong, pre-handover, there wasn't actually that much of an emphasis on Chinese history in school, or at least in the school that I went to. So like for me, I was completely oblivious to all of this. Like the dynasties. I only know like Qing dynasty, maybe a little bit of the Ming dynasty, but really nothing else about all the other dynasties and such a long and rich history in China and the art and how it affects the art and the culture. It really does go back that long, but because we don't necessarily pay attention to it or we don't study it, so we don't realize the impact that it still has today. Um, and it's just interesting to try and learn it at this point, I guess, because then you realize how much information there is.
I think one of the things that was really cool to see was also the development of pottery, and now in I mean, for the past 500, 600 years, Jingdezhen was one of the main places of pottery. There's a reason why pottery is called China, right? In the same sense that urushi is called Japan, but pottery and ceramics is a huge hobby right now, right? Glazing is a huge like thing in the ceramics community, and then to see how the development of glazes going from single color glazes to the sancai, which is the three color glaze, to wucai, which is the 5 color glaze, and seeing that history develop um, through the Ming Dynasty, that was pretty incredible as well, right? And that a lot of that was in a very small museum, the Hong Kong Heritage Museum, on the top floor, right? So that's something that's pretty cool, um, and yeah, like we said already, how much emphasis China is putting into arts. I think it's a cultural play too, right? Because they want to share how significant China was to the development of humankind and technology today, which, frankly, it's true. We wouldn't have the development of pottery. We wouldn't have the development of paper. right? A lot of gunpowder was already in China for 2,000-3,000 years. So it's something that they want to. It's a national pride issue for China, but we can reap the benefits by therefore being able to see all these cool things. And then back to the question of, well, how does AI come into this? Maybe one of the negative aspects could be the misuse of traditional symbology, right? Like traditional, let's say, the phoenix, the lion, the dragon. They all have very, traditional. They're all meaningful. They're all significant, but an AI might not know or care, how they're significant. They just like, okay, cool. Some person wanted me to do a prompt with a dragon coming out of the ground or something, but maybe that's culturally inappropriate and insensitive to that.
Or it misses out. I mean, it misses the
spirit,
the heritage behind it.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's like you're only looking at the end result. When you're generating stuff with AI in this regard. Like, I think I was listening, there was an interesting talk that I was just listening to where the speaker was talking about what's the point of art, what's the point of creating when AI can do it for you now. Like, arguably still not that well, but in certain regards, like even for AI music, even for some musicians, they cannot tell the difference anymore unless you're really, really paying attention. If it was just like playing in the background, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was AI or not. And so I think that's the negative side with AI is that it is getting better, and soon it'll be harder to distinguish what has been generated through a prompt versus what's been generated through a human being's like effort and time and experience. But the downside with AI is that it doesn't necessarily have that cultural background. It doesn't have the meaning behind it. It's only interested in creating the outcome. And the
of
outcome,
whatever the prompt is, of whatever the prompt asks.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about creating things yourself is that you as the person are changed during the process. You have to kind of, at least that's how I see it, like, because I am doing, the Urushi art myself.
So I actually went to an AI art exhibition, which...
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, which is pretty crazy, right? Pretty crazy thing to say. It was the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and it was an exhibition by a lady called Anicka Yi. I don't actually know who this person is, but I believe this is their first AI exhibition. I'm just going to read out the prompt. So, Anicka Yi's work dissolves boundaries between biology and technology, proposing new ways of thinking about perception, sentience, and survival. So basically, what this exhibition is that they created an AI and they used her previous works. They put her previous works through the AI, and then had the AI essentially come up with works that resembled her works. I'll be honest, was not my favorite exhibition. It was actually a little bit disappointing. It kind of goes against, in my opinion, what the purpose of a museum is, which is to celebrate the achievements of people. Okay, so I'm gonna read this thing. So, in recent years, Yi has turned her attention to how an artistic practice might persist beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. The death of her sister in 2017 prompted a deeper engagement with questions of mortality, memory, and the potential for technology to sustain a creative legacy. I don't really want to stop making art after my biological body ceases to function, Yi has said, a sentiment that animates her evolving relationship with machine intelligence as a mode of continuity rather than replacement. This line of inquiry led to the development of Emptiness, a software project created in collaboration with her studio and a team of engineers. Drawing from Buddhist philosophy, Emptiness is both an algorithm and a conceptual framework designed to extend Yi's practice through generative means. Trained on over a decade of her artworks, writings, and working processes, the software functions as more than an archive. It is an active, evolving system capable of producing new work in her absence. Each branch of Coral Holds Up the Light of the Moon, 2024, is the first artwork created with the system. The 16-minute video, it acts as a kind of virtual retrospective, reanimating motifs from Yi's earlier works, such as aquariums filled with contact lenses or kelp-based sculptures, into digital avatars. These entities inhabit a simulated ecosystem governed by 11 emotional and behavioral traits, interacting, mutating, and evolving over time. Yi likens this shifting structure to quantum superposition, in which multiple outcomes coexist until one takes form. So essentially, this AI is created by them so that it can still represent her art after she dies, which is really funny because that is totally against Buddhist teachings. The seeking of immortality is, in my opinion, totally against Buddhist philosophy, even though they say that it's drawn from Buddhist philosophy. And the result was this, in my opinion, just really poorly done video. I don't think this will, stand the test of time. And like I said, I think museums are there to guard, we say culture, but also in a way it's something that should be there to celebrate our achievements as human beings, as civilizations. And so when we look at stuff like this, when I went to school, I went to a school that was teaching the International Baccalaureate, and one of the key approaches to learning was understanding this idea of Homo Faber, which is man the maker. And I think art is significant, culture is significant, craft is significant because we are making those things, right? Even if we have the aid of machines to make them, we are still making them. But if an AI is able to create something without the human, right, then we are no longer making the thing, which is kind of pointless to me. It's akin to like visiting a zoo, right? Like, so yeah, I'll go to zoo and see a beaver make a dam, but that's the extent of my interest in it, right? And I think there's valid scientific curiosities that can be studied regarding how beavers make dams and why they make dams. It's like, that becomes more of a science, but it's not culture, right? It's not culture for me to appreciate how incredible human beings have evolved to become. And so when AI makes art, quote unquote, right? To me, it's in the same category. I'm just watching something make, this thing. Okay, that's cool. There's probably a lot of scientific reasons to study how AI is creating this kind of stuff, right? But to me, that's not cultural because it doesn't celebrate the magnificence of human creation. It is no longer man the maker, but machine the maker. And when it's machine the maker, then we become the auxiliary to that art.
Yeah, I think that is a very good way of putting it, because I've been also thinking about this question recently. And for me, it's like, because I have had people ask me or like suggest to me, oh, why don't you come up with the designs you do using AI? Why don't you just like use a prompt and say, oh, I want to, I don't know, this animal with this flower, and then come up with a design for me, because when I come up with, at least for the commission work, it actually does take quite some time to even come up with the final layout, the final design. And I'm always adjusting things. And halfway in the middle of the process, I'm like, does this work? Maybe I should shift things here. It's like an ongoing process, and it takes time, it takes effort. And, objectively, you could say using AI would be easier because then it can come up with 100 different things. You just pick the thing you think looks nicest. But to me, that defeats the purpose of making things. That defeats the purpose of
Well, you're not
creating
making it,
things.
right? You
Yeah,
have
you're
become the
not making it
machine.
anymore. Yeah,
You became the machine to produce what AI has told you to produce.
yeah, exactly. So for me, I still don't have a very good way of articulating things, but there's a reason I personally want to make things. And I don't want to hand over that to anything else. I still want it to come from me. And I don't know, that's probably an ego thing, or like I don't know what's the best way to describe it, but there is a sense of, I wouldn't say pride, but accomplishment maybe, when you know that the thing that you have made came from you. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect either. Like, it will never be perfect, and I think that's the point, but it's like you can see where you started and the outcome that you produce. It has that much more meaning.
Can I end this podcast with a bit of political science, if I may, because that's what I studied. When was it? I think almost more than 20 years ago. There's a political, oh my God, almost 30 years ago, 34 years ago, there was a book that was written by a, we can call him a political scientist, named Francis Fukuyama. I had the pleasure of meeting Francis Fukuyama in Japan, actually, at Keio when I was studying. But he wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. So I'm just going to read the Wikipedia kind of blurb, right? The top. The End of History and the Last Man is a 1992 book of political philosophy by American political scientist Francis Fukuyama, which argues that with the ascendancy of Western liberal democracy, which occurred after the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, humanity has reached, quote unquote, not just the passing of a particular period of post-history war, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. This book essentially argues that now that we have reached Western liberal democracy, all other forms of government will die, and all governments will start to look the same, and we have reached the end of history. Obviously, 34 years on, we know that that's not true. So, Francis Fukuyama at the time was, very heavily criticized. And there's a person called Samuel Huntington who, is not necessarily the most, let's say he's a little bit of a controversial figure as well, but he wrote a response essay, which became a book. called The Clash of Civilizations. So the Clash of Civilizations, I'm going to again read from Wikipedia. The Clash of Civilizations is a thesis that people's cultural and religious identities will be the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. The American political scientist Samuel P. Huntington argued that future wars would be fought not between countries, but between cultures. It was proposed in a 1992 lecture at the American Enterprise Institution, which was then developed into a 1993 Foreign Affairs article titled The Clash of Civilizations. In response to his former student, Francis Fukuyama's 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, Huntington expanded his thesis on a 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. So why I bring these two books up is because I think AI art is the end of history, right? Because these large language models essentially amalgamate known information and then just spits it out at you, right? And if we follow AI and AI art, pretty much we will have the homogenization of art itself. All art will start to look the same. Actually, this has already started to happen. If you look at a lot of fashion, right? Almost all fashion brands, if you see the logos, they look very similar, right? They look like they could be using the same font. If you look at the colors, right? I sent you an article about colors the other day, but you can see how color was drained from fashion, from clothing, through the past 100 years. And if we use AI art, everybody can use the same models and use the same prompts and create essentially the same output, or output that look very similar to each other where it's indistinguishable who made what. That is the end of history. But as we know, that history did not end, and we indeed had the clash of civilizations and people's experiences. As long as people will have different experiences, they will always be inspired to create art that is that draws from their experience, right? And it's important to learn from those experiences. It's important to read, consume, watch those experiences and reflect about the human condition in that way. I think art has that power. Art has always had that power, right? We look at what in the West would be considered the Greek keys, right? But that lattice symbol actually adorns a lot of bowls in Chinese and Japanese culture. You know the one I'm talking about, right? And that came through the Middle East into China and became a very classic motif here, and then probably through the Middle East to Greece, and then it became a classic motif there as well. And then we took different approaches to the same motifs and applied it in different ways through a different cultural context, through the way that those people grew up at the time, through their experiences. And now we have completely different interpretations of them. And that's important, right? That's important to see and to understand. And that's where museums can help us preserve that, put them side by side and explain, right, the lineage of these two similar looking motifs. Even the Seigaiha, which is the blue waves, right, that a lot of people think is from Japan, but actually can trace earlier roots back into China, which we saw a lot of ceramics also have Seigaiha patterns, blue wave patterns. But in Japan, it's mostly Seigaiha by itself, whereas in China, there was Seigaiha with animals, right? With birds, with ducks, with fish. That was very seamlessly incorporated into those designs as well. So again, they put them side by side. and explain the lineage and how they developed into their current forms. That's something a museum can do. That's something that we need museums to do. Galleries have a different role. They push us forward, and they showcase the new artists, the young artists, the current artists, the contemporary artists, and the galleries will determine who will be the ones that go into museums in the future, because they are the purveyors of style, of taste, right? And so a lot of these things that the galleries are selling in 100 years will probably be in a museum. Do you have anything else to say about this? I mean, I ended
I don't think
I
I can
ended with
say it
this.
any better. I don't think I can say it any better than you have. But yeah, these are all the things that I totally agree with. And it's just, how are we able to, like, not only protect this moving forwards, but also kind of have more people understand the actual importance of this, because I still feel like art is not very well understood in terms of its value in society. And I think it's partly, I was trying to think about why art has always been kind of at the periphery. Like, people kind of know it's important, but it's always been not as important as everything else. So I was like kind of thinking why. Um, and maybe, like, the way I think of it now is that because a lot of the effects are not tangible, it's a lot to do with um, like the development of your mind, like how you think about things, how do you feel about things, or even like the connection with your emotions, how you deal with the world, your interaction with the world. These are not tangible things that can be measured. They cannot be measured in GDP or, like, art can be commercialized and it has been commercialized, but if it goes too far, it loses its essence essentially. And that's what makes it different from like food, housing, whatever. These are tangible things. That you physically need. But art is more something that you need for your soul, for your
Mm,
mind.
yeah,
And those are hard to standardize. Those are hard to
Ar-
quantify.
art is a art is prompt for us to reflect on our human condition.
Mm, yeah. So I think, yeah, that's the question that we're always asking. And like through this podcast, at least, like I'm having to keep learning about what is the importance of art and how does it relate to culture, because these are things even I didn't pay attention to when I was younger. Like my interest of art was there, but I didn't think about its impact or like why is it actually important. But I think, as society moves ahead, this is like an ongoing discussion that always has to be had. Otherwise, it's so easy to forget about it. Because there are so many things like going on in the world, right? So
I think it's important to also remember that we aren't the first people to think about it. This has been a conversation that has um, probably gone on for as long as human beings have developed societies. And again, there were periods where art was condemned, right? Art was not important. Um, Even very recently, right? If you look at um, the history of China, right? From 1949 to the 70s, essentially a lot of that was discouraged, right? It was considered bourgeois. But now, as I said, I think now Chinese art is really interesting, right? There's some focus on, you know, bringing that back and kind of elevating the cultural significance of history, which was explicitly condemned as one of the four olds during the Cultural Revolution.
yeah, I think I'd probably it's too much to get into it here, but because I did listen to a lecture recently where they were looking at how art was actually addressed during like the Cultural Revolution period. So it's very interesting that they had a focus on art, but a very specific type of art.
New art.
Yeah. So at
Yeah.
that time, they actually wanted to train more people in the technical aspects of art to produce a very
Yes.
specific thing.
Yes.
But the people there actually, through that process, realized they wanted to do their own thing. And then there were the conflicts there. They were like, we don't want to, after they learned the skill, they're like, they want to use that skill to express their own thing. They wanted to express their own art, and they didn't want to actually produce the stuff they were being told to produce. So I think that speaks to art as it's a very human element. Like, you cannot force it to do something outside of the individual's will in that sense. Like, you can I mean, with commercialization and, you know, having to make money and stuff, there's a certain extent where you as the artist, you can do what other people want you to do. But if you were to really ask yourself as an artist, what do I want to do? You cannot lie to yourself. You cannot truly force yourself to do something that you are not interested in, because over time that will just wear you out.
Well, doesn't that become the same thing that we were talking about AI, right? You become the machine. You are producing something that another person or another thing has come up with. You become the auxiliary.
Yeah. So I think that's why art is so important. And yeah, it's just, how do we keep this in mind, you know, moving ahead. So I think that's a lot. I think this also leads us, because there was another topic that we wanted to get into, which was specifically...
We have to end this podcast.
Yes, we are going to end this podcast, but maybe a teaser for the upcoming episode. But
yeah,
it's like, what is that difference between making it by hand, or like handmade versus machine, basically? Because nowadays it tends to be a mix of both. Like, we cannot have everything handmade in this world, but, you know, how do machines impact and stuff. So I think, yes, we're going to end here, because it's going on for quite a long time now. But yeah, this was quite an interesting discussion. And we'll see you guys in the next episode.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye. This is a Cusado production, and you can find us on our website at cusadotokyo.com.